for multi-sided platforms. I'm very glad to see you all join us here. I'm really sorry for the delay in start caused by some technical problems as per usual, but we are in the British Computer Society and here things work very well indeed. Hopefully we're going to be able to find a few answers, I guess, to the different type of problems that we have outside the confines of this room. The one of trust and the internet. There's a lot going on out there. And by the way, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Olivier Crépin-Leblanc. I'm the chair of ISOC England. I think, yeah, it's really exciting to see you here, having come all the way from Nottingham and with all the different panelists. So I guess I can just hand the floor over to you, Ansgar, Koene, and if there's... Is this public or... So yeah, right. And is there a hashtag? Very good point. So hashtag, I was asked this question about 10 minutes ago. No, there isn't. So create one, let us know, and then we'll this is how prepared we are. Yeah? So secondly, this is indeed streamed everywhere. So this is streamed over by WebEx, and you can follow it remotely, and with the rest of the people out there. But yeah, no, it is recorded. We will put it on the website. We'll put the recording on the website afterwards, and there will be remote participants who hopefully will be able to chat, and you can see the number of people that are following us out there at the moment. And with the chat going on, I'm really sorry that we seem to have a trouble going onto the Wi-Fi apparently. But if you do manage to maybe get onto if you have a portable, like a mobile phone or something, and you want to go on the net and so on, then please do so. And please, engage in the conversation if you can get onto this room. It's Zoom, and the room number is 546-718-244. So you can also put on there. And I will test you on the number afterwards. Okay, anyway, you haven't come to speak to me or listen to me. I'm going to hand the floor over to Ansgar Koene, and he'll be able to take us through this whole discussion. And hopefully we've got about, 90 minutes or so. So we've got refreshments outside, which you can pop out to pick at any point that you wish. Of course, not all at the same time, please. But we've got, afterwards, we'll have some more refreshments, and we've got plenty of time to discuss, and hopefully we'll be able to engage with everyone in the room. So it's not just panel and you're in listening mode. It's like everyone is listen and talking mode. Anyway, thanks very much. And over to Ansgar Koene.
Thank you very much. So my name is Ansgar Koene. I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Nottingham at the Horizon Digital Economy Research Institute. And we've been doing some work related to the use of data ethics around personal data usage and questions around the way in which algorithms are affecting people, algorithms such as search engines and news feeds and those kinds of things. So coming out of that and out of the fact that ISOC has put user trust as one of the agenda points to work on, we thought about organizing this kind of this panel on user trust, and we titled it Multi-Sided Trust on Multi-Sided Platforms, referring back to a terminology that was used in the House of Lords inquiry on online platforms and the digital single market back in 2015-16. I'll say a little bit more about this definition of what is multi-sided platforms in a minute. First, I wanted to very briefly introduce our panel. So starting from the far end, we've got Catherine Miller, the Director of Policy at Doteveryone. Then moving towards me, the next one is Kate Green, who is one of the ISOC 25 under 25 awardees and is also a PhD student at the University of Nottingham. Then next we have Geoff Revill, who is founder and managing director of Krowdthink. And closest to myself is Robin Wilton, who is technical outreach for identity and privacy at Internet Society. So I'll give a very brief introduction, then we'll move on towards having some opening statements from the panel. And after that, we'll open up for discussion. I'd also like to suggest that if anybody has a burning question during one of the opening statements, to raise your hand so that we can try and address that immediately. Otherwise, we end up with a situation that the first speaker had something you really wanted to say, but by the time we're finished with the last of the opening statements, you don't remember what that was.
So with that in mind, I know this is a bit preemptive. For hashtags, would BCS trust? Always helps. For hashtags, would BCS trust be okay with uppercase BCS T and then lowercase Rust?
Yeah, I also wanted to mention, we did try to get someone from one of the big commercial platforms today, seeing as they have been in the news, it is topical, and I wouldn't, even though unfortunately Mark Zuckerberg wasn't available to come, I do suggest that don't refrain from touching on that topic. We wouldn't want that to be a big elephant in the room that everybody's avoiding. So, multi-sided platforms, what is this exactly? So the definition that was presented in the House of Lords inquiry, which was taken from the European Commission actually, is that it's online platforms refers to an undertaking operating in two or multi-sided markets, which uses the internet to enable interactions between two or more distinct but independent groups of users so as to generate value for at least one of the groups. So it's a bit of a convoluted statement perhaps, but effectively what they're getting at is any kind of a online service, a platform where we have users on one end engaging with the platform, and we have something else on the other end. For instance, with most of the advertising revenue-based social media platforms, we have the advertisers as one of the parties at the other end, and those two parties are being mediated. We've got the platform in the middle that is providing a link between the two sides. It's linking the supposed interests of the users with the things that the advertisers are offering. Other kinds of multi-sided platforms are things like booking platforms, where we have people who want to go on holiday, and we've got the hotel providers, and in the middle we have the platform that helps people find which providers, which hotels exist, and the hotels are enabled to find their customers by having this platform. So that's the general concept of the multi-sided platform. And obviously we would like to have trust from both sides on this. So I think I'll leave the general introduction as to what is the topic at that, and hand over to Catherine for her opening statement.
Should I use this?
Yes.
Olivia, do you want to move the camera? Yes, I will.
Does this all work on the technical front?
It's all working, yeah.
Okay.
It's for the remote, so.
Fine, yeah, because I think you can probably all hear me. So I am going to talk a little bit about the research that we've done at Doteveryone, which looks at public attitudes towards technology and public understanding of those technologies. I'm just going to give some broad brush statements about that research, rather than necessarily particularly linking it back into the issue around multi-sided trust. But I think in the course of the conversations, it's probably going to become quite clear why this is relevant. So one of the talking points around this conversation is why do people say they want privacy and then their behaviours don't seem to match up to that? So first of all, they do want privacy. That's what our research clearly identified. When we ask people around the subject, 95% of people say it's important to know that their data is secure. 94% say it's important to know how their data is used. 91% say it's important to be able to choose how much data they share with companies. So pretty across the board, very high figures in that, and also in the focus group conversations which we did surrounding this research, those sentiments came through very strongly. In some areas which you might expect, like when we discussed how people feel about the sharing of medical information, people were clearly extremely sensitive around that. Interestingly, they seemed less sensitive about the sharing of their political views. That didn't seem to trouble people terribly much. And then I think what came through was a tendency for people to articulate things which perhaps from amongst people who research this, we would identify as privacy, but people don't necessarily articulate it in those terms. So one focus group participant said, you know, if I go and buy a car, I don't expect the car dealer to tell every other car dealer in the town that I'm interested in buying a car and then them all to come and mob me. So there's people are picking up on this sentiment, not necessarily articulating it as an issue of privacy. So in terms of, you know, why do people say they want privacy? Certainly they do. Why do they perhaps not behave as if they want privacy? The other thing we looked at was understanding. And what became really clear was people don't understand what is actually happening with their information, and that privacy is, that their desire for privacy is perhaps being undermined. So, for example, around why do you receive personalized advertising? Why do you receive targeted advertising? 45% of people don't realize that the information that they enter into websites and social media can affect targeted advertising. You know, almost a third of people don't appreciate that information about the purchases they've made affects targeted advertising, which I find quite remarkable because, as anyone knows, you know, you buy a pair of shoes online and they follow you around the internet for weeks or afterwards. So but people aren't necessarily picking up on the fact that that is their data being collected and then turned around and used for targeted advertising. And then sort of that advertising is perhaps where people have, you know, the highest awareness to such as it is. Other less obvious mechanisms, people have extremely low awareness. So if we think about the Facebook scandal at the moment and the fact that the source of the data was someone, you know, people using an app which then gave access to their friends' information, 83% of people don't realize that information that other people share on the internet about them is gathered. So the fact that every time you join, you know, enter LinkedIn, it says, would you like us to, you know, scroll through your address book? People aren't clicking that that is a collection of their personal information.
So just a question on the LinkedIn thing. This week I received a targeted ad that masqueraded as an internal message on LinkedIn. And it's the first time I've ever seen it. It comes attached with a picture of an individual. You can't download the picture because they masquerade the picture. So is there a responsibility issue with what is commonly badged as messaging, private, whatever the term might be? And is that the real problem for multi-stakeholder platforms?
I'm going to leave that question for later on because I think that's some of the issues that probably other people are better able to get. I think it's a very relevant point, but I think just in terms, for the sake of getting through the opening remarks, I'll just sort of sketch out this and then perhaps come back to these more specific points. So those are just some examples of the kind of things that people don't understand. So I think if you ask, you know, why do people say they want privacy and not behave accordingly? Well, it's hard to behave accordingly if you're not able to make an informed choice, if you don't have the understanding and the information to do so. And we found that was really well illustrated around terms and conditions. So, you know, more than half of people are saying we sign up to terms and conditions that we don't understand or that we don't even bother reading. I think that's probably underreporting. But I think what's really pernicious, perhaps, for this issue of trust is that 43% say there's no point reading terms and conditions because companies do what they want anyway. So that trust in the goodwill of companies to behave responsibly is extremely low. So those are the sort of really top level findings around people's attitudes and people's understanding. But I think there's another interesting thing going on, which we asked a broader question around the impact of the internet on people. And overall, people are really positive. You know, they think the internet's a great thing. But when you dig into it, there's a really interesting divide. So 50% of people say it's had a really positive impact on themselves individually. If you ask the same question about what's been the impact on society, 12% say it's had a really positive impact on society. And conversely, if you ask, has it been, those who said it was negative, 20% of people said it's been negative for society, only 6% say it's been negative for them as individuals. So people are getting the personal benefits out of using the internet, but they are concerned about the societal impact. And, again, when we discussed this in detail with our focus group participants, what you got was a kind of bad, a sense of unease that people couldn't quite put their finger on what they thought was wrong, but they weren't comfortable with the way that the internet and digital technologies are changing society. And I think if we take this back to the question of privacy and trust, privacy is often articulated as a problem of the individual. But if my information, if I don't know, I haven't logged into Facebook for a while, maybe my information was part of the information that was taken by Cambridge Analytica. But what's the personal impact on me? How have I been harmed as an individual through the use of that, or through the abuse of that data? Maybe if I'm really unlucky, some of it has gone astray and someone's going to perpetrate identity fraud on me. But the chances are I'll never notice. However, as a society, if there is misinformation is spread in an election, that is a harm that we appreciate as a society. And so I think starting to change that, and so people said, why are people not more outraged when their privacy is invaded? Quite lots of times because they don't feel it. And all of this can go on without people perceiving the harm to themselves individually, but seeing overall in society, there's something going on that we're not quite okay with. And so through the conversations we've had and the research we've done, what really comes through is a sense of disempowerment about this. The people aren't able to join the dots. They want privacy. They don't understand how the things work, so they don't know where their privacy is being invaded. And they can't quite make the connection between the abuse of privacy and the changes to society that are going on. So just, I don't know if we could talk more about this, but in terms of how you sort of resolve any of this, we feel very strongly that the responsibility for this lies with the people who create products and services rather than with the individuals. And we'd like to see a really change of emphasis away from individuals having to arm themselves against a system that they struggle to comprehend, and that there should be an obligation on understandability. So I think there's been a lot of talk about transparency. Transparency doesn't help if transparency means 83 pages of terms and conditions. What we need is understandability, which highlights the trade-offs that people are getting involved in through using these technologies.
Yes, please.
It sounds like what we need.
Microphone.
It sounds like what we need is not necessarily just protection for individuals' rights, but a new approach to thinking about potential societal harms and impacts in these terms and conditions. And while platforms are so focused on the kind of consumer model of users of a service, we may be just getting torrents of societal harm because we don't have a way to think about what is good for society, and it isn't politically, it isn't the way the world works at the moment. Is this something that your report thinks about?
It's not explicitly in the report, but it's certainly something we're thinking about. And there's an issue here that there's a kind of bilateral relationship between the service and the user. It's an individual user who ticks that box and that supposedly consents. The impact, though, is felt societally. And so I think there's two ways that needs to be addressed. One is in the making of the technology, and one of the things we're exploring at the moment is how can you build into the development of technology steps at which you think through unintended consequences and societal harms, and that's kind of built in the development cycle. But I think the other thing is, essentially who speaks up for society in any other case, and that's where democratic institutions and accountability come into, where individuals are not in a position to address these issues because they don't necessarily affect them individually, then who is the organization that does that on behalf of us as a community and as a society? And that's where I feel democratic institutions need to be involved.
Thank you. Is there another brief question from the audience right now? Or does anybody from the panel want to respond to something from Catherine? In that case, I suggest we move on to Kate for her opening statements.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for letting me be here today. It feels like quite a privilege, to be honest. So I'm Kate Green, and I think it's fair to say that I would consider myself as a cautious internet user and also a young academic. And I'm doing my PhD, and my focus at the moment is looking at online health communities, specifically the inflammatory bowel disease community, and how we come to share sensitive health information in contemporary commercial platforms. But this wasn't always the case. I have grown up with the internet, and I was always very trusting of it. Whenever a platform or a service would offer me, something they're going to give me, whether that's a social platform, whether that's a search engine, any of those things, and then they delivered it, I didn't feel like there was a reason not to trust that platform, and so I would keep using it, as do many other people. Just tick the terms and conditions, and away we go. So as they keep delivering what they say they're going to deliver, we use them more and more, and as a consequence of using them more and more, the more data we are giving them all the time. And so we become really familiar with these platforms, and we just keep on trusting them because we haven't really felt any negative consequences from sharing this data. And so it kind of comes as no surprise that people end up talking about their health information within communities, and they feel safe to do so. And to be honest, if this was in a different context, if this was in the public sector, in the medical sector, this data would be extremely regulated and would not be kind of handled in the same way. And as we know, there's always an element of risk when we start to trust, or when we want to trust a platform or a person or anything like that. But interestingly, when it has come to one of my studies, my first study that I'm currently doing for my PhD, the majority of the participants, when they were asked, they believe that there is no risk or some social risk when it comes to sharing information about their health on the internet, which strikes me as quite alarming. But these social risks kind of include trolling, having hurtful comments, so something that they can really feel as a harm. And there was a couple of people who did remark on government and sort of commercial surveillance, but there were only 2 people that actually mentioned that out of about 35, so it was very much a minority. And what's interesting when we talk about social risk is that platforms, we all understand it. We all understand sort of the social barriers of privacy, and lots of platforms have responded to that in some way. And I think it's fair to say that Facebook is probably the best platform to talk about when it comes to this, because there are so many different privacy settings that you can change, whether that's from changing your profile from public to friends of friends to only friends, or some things you can just set as only yourself. You can change, you can be in groups, which could be closed groups, they could be private groups. You can make it so that you have to request that someone invites you to a tag rather than just tagging you in something, for instance. And what this kind of gives us is, it makes people believe, oh, this platform is working in our best interest because I perceive this social risk, and they're giving me an ability to mitigate against that risk. They're doing me a good service. And so again, why should I distrust this platform? So does this actually present us with a false sense of security? Many of the Facebook users that I have talked to who use closed groups as a means to talking about their health and their worries, whether that's an emotional stress or whether that's a physical worry that they currently have. They believed that because they were in a closed group where their friends and other people couldn't see that information, they believed that third parties, whether that's commercial or otherwise, could not have access or insight into that data. Now, that makes me feel extremely uncomfortable that there is this sort of perception of security and safety, and that people are very unaware of what could be happening with their data. But when I kind of asked the question, they said, most of them said that they'd never really thought about it before. And when they were kind of processing it as I was asking them, a lot of them did feel quite uncomfortable with the possibility that a pharmaceutical company, for instance, could look at that information. They often said that, never mind, the benefits of me being in this place, being in this community, far outweighs any risk involved. Now, I partly wonder whether that's kind of to do with the third-party effect, because it hasn't happened, no risk or any harm has directly happened to them yet, but who knows? So I often worry at the moment how much as a society we are trusting platforms, and I worry even more that even when we don't trust them, that people don't feel like they have any kind of agency or empowerment to do much about it. We have the hashtag delete Facebook, but how many people are actually deleting Facebook? Very, very few. And that's kind of what I want to leave you with.
Okay, thank you very much. So we had one question from the room. Microphone.
Hi, Dave Marcel. Not working.
Should be.
Hello? Hello?
It's not broadcasting, yeah.
So my name's Dave Marcel. I was a third-party networking and integration specialist for in excess of 10 years. And at one point, I actually stopped the board of the company I worked for being eligible for arrest in America. And I think one of the key problems, and this might be relevant for your research, is a definition of your trusted second parties. And I think a lot of these multi-platform issues come down to that. Everyone's quite comfortable with a third party as someone I wouldn't touch with a barge pole. Most people are happy with the fact they trust themselves, albeit on their platforms that might not be as trustworthy as they think. Do you feel that there's a valid reason to perhaps define second parties, those that you trust, to a greater extent as part of the multi-platform view?
Yes, absolutely. Don't have an awful lot to add to that, but it is really interesting when people who have a health condition consider sort of the second and third parties who might be involved. Some people do seem relatively happy if a commercial party, whether that's a pharmaceutical company doing research or those kinds of entities, they seem reasonably happy with it as long as it's doing societal good, but they were uncomfortable if they were going to be manipulated to have money or for the company to make money off of their ill health. But underpinning all of that is that they wanted to have consent and knowledge that this was going to be happening, which they felt that they hadn't been approached at that point or anything at the moment. But yeah, so that was kind of like the general kind of comments.
What's the second party?
To me, I guess I don't actually know the answer to that question. So, I mean, first party is kind of who you're sharing that data with directly, so whether that's Facebook, Twitter, or any of other ones, and then third parties is the ones that they are sharing that with.
You're the first party. That's the bit in between. I'd be interested to see after your research what the view of somebody is.
I'll keep that in mind. Alrighty.
Thank you. And so one of the messages online is to refer to this kind of thing as a pseudo-privacy is the proposal, that platforms are building trust by offering superficial privacy that isn't true privacy. Shockingly, the providers, developers themselves, so the claim is that the providers and developers actually themselves aren't even aware to the extent the extent to which the kind of privacy that they're offering isn't actually privacy, which is probably true in the sense that a party within the organization is building the tools for setting your privacy settings, etc., and that, and there's another party within the organization that's involved in the monetization of the platform, and probably there's not really a sufficient integrated overview of what's going on. Were there any further questions for Kate? Or did the panel have something they wanted to relate?
Although that last question nicely sets me up. So.
Excellent. Yes, we do have one more.
One quick comment on your views on medical data and pharmaceutical companies. The interesting thing is that almost the only people who are serious about the security and privacy of medical information are the pharmaceutical companies. Their processes are far more rigorous than anybody else's, because any leaks of that data is dangerous. Any compromises in that data, inaccuracies, are potentially lethal. And yet they're always viewed as the bad guys. Nice, cuddly academics, they're the nice guys. And yet they usually have no budgets for security, and they regard their own research as far more important than the privacy of those they're dealing with. I would just like to make that point, that very often reality is the opposite of the image.
My only comment to that would be, I don't really correlate directly the issue of security and privacy.
And there was also a request.
And I'll comment on that further in my own presentation in a minute.
I should say the security bit, the privacy bit, is for a pharmaceutical company. It's to do with the accuracy of the data, that it is accurate and reliable, and it has not been compromised on the way. Because inaccurate data is very dangerous.
If I could just add to that, it's also, Richard Barrett, it's also that the pharmaceutical companies appreciate the enormous commercial value of that data. And that's why they're protecting it for themselves, not for the data subjects.
Yeah, and if you want to value that data in the context of privacy, then the extent to which the individual whose data was shared, the degree to which they understand the purpose of that data. I doubt very much the pharmaceutical companies are entirely honest with those people exactly what the consequences of sharing that data could be on them and on society. So when it comes to privacy, I don't think they're necessarily fully stepping up to the mark.
I disagree profoundly with that comment, but I will pass over to
I think also while the microphone's making its way, sorry, Philip, the academic researchers are not entirely unconstrained in what they do with data. They've got ethical review boards to satisfy, and they can get hauled over the coals if they do the wrong thing.
I have to disagree with you, because I think if you take a site like Patients Like Me, which is run by pharmaceutical companies, the people who take part in it are people who've got, on the whole, rare or unusual diseases, and they're linked into a group, and that helps them, because they all say what secondary problems they may be having, taking a particular medication, and so on. And by doing that, they help the pharmaceutical companies to improve the medication or the way it's distributed. And people are going into that with their eyes open, and it's doing a fantastic service. And I think it's a win-win situation by having a properly secured, excellent group where people are sharing medical data for their own benefit and for the benefit of other people who might have that disease. So I cannot accept what you were saying.
So I agree actually with everything extent to which the individual who's untold in the context.
Is it? Is the light on?
The extent to which the individual understands the full potential utilization of the information that they share goes potentially way beyond the specifics of helping pharmaceutical companies create a specific drug to help them specifically. That the value of that data goes beyond that into other consequences, into areas, for example, I'll just say a really extreme one, into biological warfare. Right? I mean, clearly that's not probably happening in most cases, but my point being that the extent to which it gets used beyond their understanding is where the line of privacy comes into question. And that's really my point.
My query is that who's auditing that data? I mean, who's auditing the pharmaceutical company's data? Is there an outside body auditing it?
There are usually ethical committees doing that. As far as
Sorry. There are usually ethical committees, but as far as academics and research on medical data is concerned, I think one of the best protocols that exists in this country is the one between the Medical Research Council and the Office of National Statistics, saying how patient data, some anonymized and some with consent not anonymized, is shared for medical academic research. And that is a very good protocol for dealing with the privacy issues in that area as well.
I think the issue of anonymization is one I'd like to go into, but we probably haven't got time, except to say that generally speaking, those that anonymize are not actually truthful with the people that they're telling it's anonymized to. That actually, anonymization is not absolute. It's a variable, and the extent to which that has been calculated and validated and the risk associated with that is not communicated to the individual. And in that, I believe there's a dishonesty in the privacy equation that goes on when the anonymization term is used. So that's something I'd like to see, and I've spoken directly to the ICO on that before, trying to get them to be more open and honest about that issue. It's a bigger issue.
Okay, I propose that we move on now to have Geoff give his opening statement.
So I've got some slides, so I'll just wait a second while our technical guy sorts us out. Hey, here we go. Yeah, looks like we've got something. So I'm a commercial guy. I'm from the technology sector.
The slides are not yet visible to the people in the room.
Oh, it's not there yet. Okay. We can see them. Yeah. The people on the internet can see what I'm talking about. There we go. Right. Okay. Everybody can see what we're talking about. And one of the things that was really kind of an eye-opener for me many years ago was, as a technologist, I actually wrote a bit of the internet, so I know how it works. And I've been and I've worked in Silicon Valley, and I'd seen how people like Facebook were operating. And I had a very detailed understanding of all of that. But it didn't really inhibit me from doing anything fundamental about it until my daughter turned 13. And she said, "Daddy, can I have a Facebook account?" And this daddy knows precisely what that means. And I knew precisely that the only answer, a positive answer to that, was me pimping out my daughter's digital life to a company that would sell it to anybody for any purpose going on. And I could not, with any honesty, say to my daughter, "Of course you can, darling." So my answer was, "God, no, not a chance in hell." Which my wife said, "All right, what's the alternative?" I thought, "Oh, you bugger." You got me, because actually that's really the key question. What's the alternative? Right? We're all talking about Facebook and how terrible they are and everything else. Well, actually, to be honest with you, the way Facebook developed was a fundamental consequence of the way the internet was when they started. The way they built a business model has helped build the internet. So actually, in many ways, hats off to them. They did a bloody good job. Have they gone wrong? Damn right they have, unfortunately. And unfortunately, their shareholders have driven them that direction. So there's something fundamentally problematic with that model. And it's a business model. It's not a technology issue. It's a business model issue. So I asked myself the question, what was the issue that needed to be addressed to answer my wife's question? And the answer was, of course, that I didn't trust Facebook. So how would you build a social platform that was fundamentally trustworthy, where a future generation of parents, when asked by their 13-year-old daughter, "Can I use the Crowd," which is our platform, the answer would be, "Of course you can, darling. So how do you move from, oh my God, no, to of course you can, darling? And that was what set me thinking about how to build a new kind of social platform that was fundamentally different. And one of the things I fundamentally understood about trust is that there's no absolute measure of trust. Everything's consequential or contextual. So actually, I'm going to summarize my starting statement by saying, don't seek trust, seek to be trustworthy. What does that mean? Oh, it's actually working. Wonderful. Technology's going for me. Yay! So I looked at that in several different dimensions. One was trust in the context of cybersecurity. You talk to a cybersecurity guy and he'll think about trust in the context of security. Right? Talk to other people here, we've had the presentations here about trust, and they talk about it in the context of privacy. Right? And where I wanted to talk about it was to extend that more broadly into the context of digital engagement, using the internet as an engagement tool, and how do you build trust in that. So these were the sort of ways in which I tried to look at trust. And when I looked at cybersecurity, the only honest answer for anybody who's actually built secure systems, and I have, many of them, is there's no such thing as a cybersecure system. There isn't any such thing as a secure system on the internet. Everything is fundamentally security flawed. Everything will be hacked at some point. All data will be accessed sometime. If not today, maybe 5 years from now or 20 years from now. A human being will make a stupid mistake. They'll take a copy of a disk and leave it in an inappropriate location. The key to understand about cybersecurity is not how good it is, although that is important. It's that it's about the consequences of the breach and what happens there. And that's really where you have to understand that the consequences will accrue ultimately to the individual. So you've got to think about security from that point of view. You also have to understand it's an arms race. Okay? So basically, every time I add a new layer of capability into my system for security, then somebody's going to build a cleverer way of undermining that level of security. So it's an ongoing race, and the only way I can maintain trust in this context is by keep building more secure systems and trying to make sure it's kept secure. But you have to accept something really fundamental when you're building a trustworthy platform, is that at some point I'm going to lose your data. Right? Be honest about it. It's going to happen to every single one of us. The bigger you get, the more likely it's going to happen. Yeah? When Facebook last had a major data breach, and this was before the Cambridge Analytica stuff, they said, don't worry, we spotted it, and we captured it before more than 6 million accounts were hacked. To which I went, holy moly, I live in the Southwest. That's the entire population of the Southwest, plus a bit. But then to them, 6 million, 2 billion, we did our job. We kept it secure. So think about it in the context of privacy. Well, every person's view of privacy is different. It's modified by context, its usage, the principles that individual holds, the culture of the country or religion they come from, values that they personally hold, and the implementations that they experience. So privacy can't really be measured in that way, but there is one way in which you can look at privacy, and it's really, really simple. We can all agree when it's breached. And if you understand that and focus on that issue, I think that's really important for understanding how you're going to build trust with people. And it's breached when the data I provide is used for a purpose other than for which I understood it to be provided. The moment that happens, a privacy breach has occurred and trust is going to be lost. So if you want to be trustworthy, you need to be really clear about what purpose the data is being put to. So the overriding personal principle that we apply is that all personal metadata belongs to the individual, and we are only temporary custodians of it. Thank you very much for letting us have some of your data so that we can service you and make some money, but it's your data. You have to build your systems with that in mind. So what is trust? Well, as a social platform, we have to look at it in two dimensions. One was the social, an attitude of confident expectation that one's vulnerabilities will not be exploited. True for medical data, for example. But, it's an awful, we've seen it at the societal level as well now, the political information that's going on. On the business side, it's slightly different. It's more about the value exchange and the degree to which I've got what I believe is something that's fair. Now, the question is, given how much money Facebook's making off our data, is it fair that we're giving it to them and they're making that much data out and we don't really see a share of it? Well, I probably wouldn't mind too much if the tax system was sufficiently rigorous that the amount of money that got sent back to our exchequer was commensurate with our engagement. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Bigger you are, the more you can dodge. So, kind of interesting. So I looked into thinking, how do you build trust into a company as a product value? So like I said, first of all, seek to be trustworthy. That's the goal. You have to understand what trust is. So there are 3 building blocks to trust. Transparency, first and foremost. Clarity about what information, what purpose. Making it really easy for people to understand that. Giving them control. Decide when you can have access to that data and when you can't. Whether or not they want to change the utilization of that data. That's something that you should be empowering the individual. You use the word disempowerment in your presentation. Really important. Really important. Trust is actually a function of empowerment of the individual and the equation of that empowerment that's going on. With Facebook, the reason people are uncomfortable with it, and interesting, your 12% number of people not distrusting society matches directly with the number of people that actually trust Facebook. It's kind of interesting. So this control issue is really important, and then ultimately give them the power of remedy, give them the right to recourse if something goes wrong. And when we were thinking about that, we were thinking about this before the GDPR. Interestingly, by the way, the GDPR was constructed with KPI of trust as a primary objective. So for us, becoming GDPR compliant was 0 effort, it turned out, because we built against the same KPI. So what's the remedy actually mean? Well, frankly, the law is inaccessible to most people. We're separated from access to it by an ICO who arbitrates whether or not a company will be held truly accountable, irrespective of the consequence to me as an individual. So the consequence to me, the law doesn't care. We have this arbitrator who sits there and decides whether or not that's appropriate, and that arbitrator is paid for by the government. Okay, so guess where the balance of power goes there? Certainly isn't in my direction. Our ICO has a strong reputation across Europe as being, shall we say, pro-business. So when you're looking at it from the individual point of view, what's the real right of remedy? Well, actually, it's the right of removal of information. And that's actually as it happens in the GDPR. So you should build that functionality in so that they can take away their information. Hey, if I don't trust you anymore, if you failed me for whatever reason, then I have the right to recourse. We need to build that into our systems. So how do you implement this at the product development level? I know I'm tight on time, so I'll try and do this really quickly. Obviously, you build your system secure by design. I won't go into what that means. Those that know should know. You can challenge me later. Fundamentally, follow the 7 principles of privacy by design. Absolutely, definitely. Be open about your business model. How are you going to make money? If you're not open about it, how do I know that I can trust you? Okay? Because it's all about the money at the end of the day. If it isn't about the money, then you're in research, and you're still about the money. So, and no covert profiling or tracking. What we actually discovered was kind of interesting. We didn't really realize this when we started, but as we implemented, we actually found the single most important principle to follow was actually in Article 25 of the GDPR, and it's user data minimization. Because if you think about it, given that I know that at some point any data you entrust to me could get lost, then the consequences accrue to you. The best thing I can do for you in my platform is to figure out how to minimize those consequences to you. And I minimize them by minimizing the amount of data that's potentially lost. And one of the things that we realized is that the way the internet is today is very different to when Facebook started. When Facebook started, you needed to aggregate everything into this cloud thing. Because if you didn't have enough value to return back to the individual user. The internet is all pervasive today. It's fundamentally different to when Facebook started. There's no reason why we can't be using real-time data flows in a temporal fashion and not sustaining access to the data and minimize our data utilization by using that thought process. And I come from a real-time systems world, so that was natural to the way we developed, but it turns out very, very powerful in terms of building a fundamentally trustworthy platform. So that's our model for building a fundamentally trustworthy future platform. It's specific to social in our particular context, but I think principles that we've adopted are quite universally applicable and potentially answers the question that was asked earlier on about how would you go about building fundamentally trustworthy platforms in the future. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. Yes. A microphone from the back.
Okay, right. like your view on the business model that I'm told Payoga used for the medical records for those doing medicals for one of the Northern Fun runs, because everybody had to take a medical before they actually went on the fun run.
Okay.
And the business model was, you paid for that medical, that data belongs to you. Here, however, is a list of all of those people who will pay for access to the following data from your medical test. And this is what they will pay. If you are willing, we will provide it to them in this form, and you will receive what they pay less 30%, which is our margin for administering the data. And the interesting thing about that business model was, because it was based on explicit informed consent, the value of that data for sale was approximately 5 times data from those who'd not given informed consent.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, real informed consent makes the data that much more valuable to those who want to pay for access to good data.
So I think the first comment on that, or first question on that, would be, for privacy purposes, it's not just about what data, it's what purpose.
Absolutely.
And was the purpose articulated by the people that were purchasing the data, and was that understood by the people who were selling their data?
Oh, yes. So one of the ones was that one of the medical insurance companies was quite happy to pay £120 per lead, and it was quite clear what it was that they were wishing to sell to that individual. That was very explicit on this, because otherwise it was not properly informed consent.
Okay. In that case, I see nothing wrong with that model. I mean, it's open, it's transparent, it's clear what the data is, because I've already got it, and it's clear the limited purpose of use. Now, as long as that is absolutely clear and there isn't anything hidden in those T's and C's that says they're going to use it for other stuff, which I would probably say I'd go and have a very close look at, then, I don't see anything wrong with that. In fact, there are companies, like Citizen Me, I don't think you come across them, they're doing a very similar thing in the marketing research realm, saying, data that somebody's explicitly shared for a specific purpose can be provided in a way that it increases its value due to the fact it was explicitly and knowledgeably shared. And why not? Data is not a bad thing as long as it's understood purpose limitation.
Catherine wanted to respond.
Very quick, I wanted to know, how do you make money?
Knew somebody would ask, I always do. So you have to understand more about what our platform is to do that, which is why I kind of avoided the question. But so in short, there's no point trying to create a social platform that competes with Facebook, because everyone's on Facebook, right? An awful lot of people have tried to create private versions of Facebook and failed for a very good reason. So the question we asked ourselves was, how would we build a platform that wouldn't fundamentally be competitive to Facebook and would solve a different type of problem in the social context? And what we realized was that this thing here is fundamentally different as a platform to when Facebook started. And its key value proposition is mobility. And that means location. And what was intriguing to me in terms of data was that people who aren't technical understand the creepiness of sharing their location over time and how insightful that potentially is. And they tend to avoid doing so. Lots of studies have shown this, which is kind of interesting, which actually means that we're inhibited from using the location value of this device in a digital social context. So we're called the crowd for a reason. We connect any crowd of people together anywhere at any time. We do that by not knowing their location. And what we do then is we have an overlay service. So the app itself is free, but we have a software as a service kind of thing where the people who are managing an event or managing a venue can manage the social platform that's associated with their physical space or venue, and they can orchestrate that. If they want those orchestration tools, they pay us a fee. No data exchange. purely them wanting to have a high degree of control. Now, as it happens, we also just recently won a contract from the Office of Counter-Terrorism.
Can you speak into the mic?
Sorry. We also just won a contract from the Office of Counter-Terrorism, a very competitive, hard competitive bid, and they were looking for people to innovate in the context of crowd resilience after the Manchester bombings and that kind of stuff. And we were one of the top 2 winners for that. And essentially, we're building out an extension to our functionality so that the security services for large venues can also pay us a fee for being able to engage their crowds in keeping themselves safe. So essentially, overlay services is the short answer to the question, but contextual to venues and events.
Just before going back to the room, I wanted to pick up on a question that came up in this from online, which was about inferred data. So things that algorithmically, through combining other kinds of data sets, are being inferred about a person. So it's not directly the data that the person has contributed. Would you, on your platform, have any kind of inferred data that comes about in the processing? And generally, not just on your platform, how would you see the way to deal with inferred data?
We don't at the moment, but we will have as we build out the model for the safety products. Because one of the interesting things is if you're facilitating people raising alerts to the local security team, the question arises as to how much can you trust that individual. And the way in which they have utilized our application gives us some indicators as to their trustworthiness in the context of when they raise such an alert. So that's an inferred data context, which we then use. What are the consequences to that? The consequences in this particular case would be whether or not how high a priority their alert would be taken. If there were 10,000 alerts coming from a crowd of 50,000 people, where would theirs come in the list? Well, it was somewhat dependent in terms of a filtering algorithm. And that's just us trying to make it a usable data set for the security manager. There's no actual consequence to the individual, and we're also completely transparent about that data with those individuals about what's being collected on them and how it's being used. So,
but if we're talking about something that's inferred about a particular individual and the platform says any data about a particular individual that individual has control over, how does the individual get control over the inferred data?
In our platform, yes, they can delete it if they want.
I'll go to the room.
We've had some GDPR workshops with ACS Law Group, and earlier this month we had Koene, which is the French regulator, and we had Dr. Amandine Jambert, and she actually was very clear that one of the categories that would be explicitly covered by GDPR would be any future inference. And one example might be how I might be a swing voter and thus targeted for a knock on the door in an election. So I just don't know how you process that, but I just think that's a valid viewpoint.
So one of the things you have to think about is whether or not consent is required or there's a legitimate interest for the use and purpose. In our particular case, we believe there's a legitimate interest because they're raising an alert and they want us to take it seriously so that we can respond to them and help them. We went through a legitimate interest assessment on that, and we felt that we didn't need explicit consent for that particular purpose. We are transparent because you have to be under the GDPR about what we're doing and how we're doing it.
So prior to the Madrid bombings, our experts in terrorism mostly lived in Belfast, and at 7:15 on the morning of the Madrid bombings, I've never seen this reported publicly. I know someone who saw 9 people with furtive glances and big rucksacks getting onto the trains. And as a Belfast resident, she knew they were bombers, and she reported it and was ignored by the Spanish police. So going forward, perhaps your ears on platform could be a service to others as well.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea of the extensions we're adding for crowd security is simply this, is that the eyes and ears and the intuition of every individual in a crowd crowded place, there should be a means by which you can aggregate that and bring that up to the attention of those trying to keep you safe. And you can choose to participate in that process. You know, where nobody's forcing anything onto anybody. But if we empower everybody in the next Manchester Arena song concert where there's a security risk, then they can choose to try and keep themselves personally safe, and by so doing, keep the crowd safe. And that's kind of the sort of central thrust of what we will be trying to do, and we'll be demonstrating this in November this year.
So I propose we move on to Robin for your opening statement. We're halfway through the...
Thank you. So while Olivia is bringing the slides up, I'd just like to thank the BCS and Horizon and the UK chapter of ISOC for hosting this and for inviting me on. I'm an ISOC staff member, but that doesn't mean that I'm entitled to do anything that, with or to the UK chapter, so I appreciate the invitation very much. Well now, how do I follow those three? We've covered principles, we've covered social aspirations, we've covered practicalities. Doesn't leave much space for me, so I'll try, I guess, and hit on some themes, perhaps by way of summary. That wasn't quite what I was expecting next. Oh. Okay. Well, that's okay.
The internet is seeing...
There we go. Okay. Well, so...
Yeah, so the internet is still seeing something
That's
else,
okay.
is it?
I think it's probably... Yeah. All right. Yeah. I thought I'd try and bring a definition of trust. Geoff's touched on a couple, but this is my simple one, that trust is a belief, and it's a belief that someone will act in your interest, or a slightly weaker way of expressing it is a belief that someone won't act contrary to your interests, even if they have the opportunity and motivation to do otherwise, or to do so if it's contrary. And like any belief, it may be based on lots of different things, and some of those things may be reliable and some of them may not. So trust may appear compelling to us at the time for all kinds of reasons, and some of those reasons may be wrong. This is essentially how con artists work. They present you with things that you want to believe, and so you trust those beliefs and you get conned. But moving on from that optimistic example, so some observations. I think that one of the opportunities we have with this latest set of revelations about how the online world really works and what our real role is in it and the real effects it can have on us. One of the opportunities is to revisit some of our assumptions about things like trust and privacy and data protection. And one of my observations here is that privacy is a system problem, and it doesn't generally appear that way to us. We grow up learning about privacy from our own egocentric perspective. Privacy is about keeping yourself to yourself and not having other people know stuff about you that you didn't want them to know. I can still remember going home from school and my mother saying, I need to have a word with you, young man. Your teacher has mentioned something that I'm not entirely happy about. And I thought, hold on, you're an adult at home and my teacher is an adult at school. How do you know what happened at school? These are two different contexts. I didn't think of it in terms of contextual integrity at that time, because obviously when I was 4, Helen Nissenbaum hadn't written her paper yet. But that was what was going on. I suddenly, as a 4-year-old, thought, my contextual integrity has been violated here. I misbehaved at school, and I don't expect that information to percolate through into the home context. So although privacy appears to us as an egocentric personal problem, it's actually a system problem. And my privacy, sorry, I hang around Americans too much. My privacy depends on the behavior of other people, obviously. And that's a thing which I think bears stating explicitly. It relates to Geoff's point about the disciplines of information security and privacy being related but not the same. Because actually privacy is about disclosure. And that sounds paradoxical. But privacy is the ability to disclose something in a given and known context with expectations about the scope of that disclosure and the purpose for which it will be used. So just think of how many of those assumptions are violated in the online model. You might be disclosing something on the basis that you're doing it in a given context. That's probably not the context in which you're disclosing it. So once I grew up and had 4-year-olds of my own, I would encounter that situation where there's a lot of laughing going on in the sitting room. And I walk into the sitting room and the laughing all stops. And a child says, "And I think it is a very nice bicycle," in a totally genuine and convincing way. There were conversations that they were happy to have between themselves that they were not happy to have when an adult was in the room. This is the big lie of social media. They put you in a context where you are talking to your buddies and your close friends and your friends and family. And that is a context in which you are encouraged to think you are making the disclosures. It is not the context in which you're making the disclosures. There is a third party present who has a commercial interest in monetizing every interaction in that forum. And so that basic principle, that basic assumption that privacy is disclosure in a given context is violated from the outset. And I think we need to seize this opportunity to make more and more people aware of that fact of life. That was longer than I expected to spend on that slide, so I think I'll move on. Our privacy depends on the behavior of others. And everything we do online is mediated through at least one third party, second party. Adjust the number up and down as you wish, I'm not bothered. The point is that in dealing with Philip online, anything that I send goes through someone else. If I want that message to be confidential, I might encrypt it before sending it to Philip, but I do want him to see it. So I have to give him the means to decrypt the message and read it. The technical protection that I applied in order to keep my message secure from Olivier has now gone because I wanted Philip to read the message. What he does with it after that, I cannot technically control. So if I'm dependent on intermediaries and second and third parties who have access to my data at some point, there are some things that I want them to do. And the simplest statements that I have been able to come up with so far as to what I want them to do are these three. I want them to accept some constraints on what they do in the interests of the trust relationship with me. So that governs what they can do. There are things that they must do or mustn't do. And under that heading, I want them to be governed by the law, by regulation, by self-imposed codes of conduct. And I want them to agree to exceed the requirements of what is mandatory, what they are legally obliged to do, where doing so gives more weight to my interests. And I think Geoff's platform offers quite a good example of how that can be put into practice. Geoff's platform does things that he's not legally obliged to do because he sees them as being in the interests of concert goers, people who want to contribute to the safety of the crowd they're in, and so on. That's an ethical responsibility, it's not a legal one. So that comes to the third point. I want data controllers to commit to go beyond what they're legally required to do and take actions that are based on things like transparency and fairness and respect for the individual. And there are a number of practical ways in which they can demonstrate those ethical principles. And this, I think, comes back to something that I think it was Catherine said. And it was about building privacy into the product or service from the outset. I used to go along with the idea for ages that technology is essentially neutral ethically, and that the ethical dimension comes from what you do with it. until I heard a fantastic talk by Sarah Spiekermann from the University of Vienna, where she said, that's ridiculous. Technology is not neutral. Any technology is the result of a series of decisions, each of which has an ethical dimension. And so any technology that reaches the market has an ethics built into it by default, because it's the consequence of all those choices. So technology is not ethically neutral. And I want those ethical values to be built into the design process. And thankfully, there's a growing and increasingly mature discipline of value-based design that teaches you how to integrate ethical principles into the design and development process. And I'd like to see more of that, and I'd like to see it imposed as a set of requirements, either by the market or by codes of conduct or by regulation. And I'm nearly there. Those say the things that I've basically just said. I told you that would happen, didn't I? That thing where you speak to a slide and then you flick to the next one and it says all the stuff you just said. Well, that's okay, because we can move on to the next one. So a couple of closing thoughts. We've all been told we live in a data-driven economy. We've all heard that thing that personal data is the new oil, and they say it like it's a good thing. But look at the oil industry, for goodness sake. Yeah? It's not sustainable. It's taken us the best part of a century to realize that. Let's not take a century to realize that the way that we treat data as raw material is not sustainable either. And let's think about what sort of society we want the data-driven economy to create and to contribute to. Those aren't data protection questions. So we can't actually fix this problem of trust just by drafting some new data protection rules. They will be part of the solution. But the questions we need to be asking are those much wider ones. What sort of a society do we want the data-driven economy to contribute to? What outcomes do we want as citizens and as data subjects? And that's quite enough from me, and I'm sure that has, I hope that has provoked some thoughts and questions.
Thank you very much. So open to questions to the room, and can get this. Yeah, feedback.
Remind us
Yes.
again.
I told myself. All I asked was, when I see a new attack on me personally in my space, I look at it and I think, has anyone else seen it? No. And it's petty that Microsoft, who now own LinkedIn, have used what was formerly regarded as a semi-private messaging service, which is not defined perhaps, and it's tied to the trust levels, because on this platform your second parties are effectively joint controllers. And my argument, I think, when you've done your PhD, will be to define second controllers is critical, and it comes back to your close friends and family you can't necessarily control. So very simple. I've received something that masquerades as a message in my LinkedIn mailbox associated with work that I've done with people that are currently in the same cohort as me on a platform, and it's uniquely targeted, in my opinion, but I can't prove it, on the basis of activities I'm doing on someone else's platform. But I can't go back to the sender of the message because the picture's a fake one, the image isn't real, I can't even reverse look up the image, which is a technique for hacking. And the problem is, it breaches my internal view of that platform, which has to date been, this is a messaging app, and should thus be treated as a messaging, and thus in confidence with a joint view that you should not share and damage the other person. But it's obviously a robot that's attacked me. So it ties to joint control, messaging, and the way a platform works. And it's new.
Yeah,
but it's the standard way in Facebook.
Thank you. Shall I take a quick stab at that one? I think you've raised, to my mind, two distinct problems, and they are both entirely valid problem statements. The first one is the classic one of Why are you seeing this advertisement based on something that you did on a totally unconnected platform? I saw I bought a fountain pen in Seville a month ago, and I paid cash for it in a shop. And a month later, I see an advertisement on the Guardian's website for replacement nibs for that brand of pen. So what's the, how do you join the dots on that one? So I think, that's part of what you describe, and that's an issue that I think we all recognize from targeted advertising. I think the other one is, what are the issues that arise when you sign up under one set of terms and conditions, and for various reasons, those terms and conditions change over time? We've all seen that happen with Facebook. Matt McKeon's, McKeon, McKeon, did the most amazing infographic of that unfortunately only covers Facebook's default privacy settings between 2010 and 2015 or 2005 and 2010, I think. And it shows, like an opening rose, how the default privacy settings for your information spread. That was just Facebook over a period of time itself, changing its own terms and conditions. But when Microsoft buys LinkedIn and they retrospectively apply a different set of terms and conditions, and Google had the same thing when do you remember they had a single set of terms and conditions they wished to apply over a set of services that people had signed up for individually, and they got smacked for it. So there's that other issue, is how do you, it's a changing context again. You joined under one set of terms and conditions, and you're now being expected to operate under another one. So there's a transparency deficit there that the users need to be made aware of, and they need to be given a genuine choice about what to do.
So I agree with all that, but I think we can simplify things to a certain extent and say, look, they've breached your trust. They've done something that you're not comfortable with. So the alternative should be for you to walk away and use an alternative platform. But you can't, because everyone's on LinkedIn or everyone's on Facebook. And so the lack of, the fact that we've created this economic environment in which we have a few power brokers for our digital connectivity to those around us is very problematic. And the new regulation doesn't solve this problem, by the way, because we've been struggling with this one. Let me give you a very simple example. I say, okay, we've built the product so that you can delete any data in our app very easily. We've got an incremental consent model. Everything's contextual. Everything's documented. And you set sharing settings. You don't set privacy settings, because to me, if you set a privacy setting, by default, your platform's not private by design, right? So if you start with privacy by design, the only thing you need is to extend the degree to which you're sharing data, right? Which should be under your control. But there's various sets of data which we incrementally allow you to consent to. So when you enter the app, basically anybody who's in the same location at the same time could follow you. So that's a follower list, right? So they're following you. So okay, that's fine. And then when you choose to follow somebody, that's a different linked list. Okay. So here's the interesting question. To what degree do you have the right to export that data and take it elsewhere? And that's one I haven't been able to come up with a definitive answer for yet, because it's not just your data. So how do you make this kind of information set portable in an information society where engagement and digital connectivity is so central to what we do? I don't think we've answered that question yet, and I don't know the answer to that. Sounds like maybe you've got an answer? Only put your hand up if you've got an answer to that question, by the way.
Our view that you only have to share the data, you only have to be able to export it if it's data that you've given. So the fact that you've acquired data within the app, which is associated with me as an individual, I don't have the right to take that data elsewhere. It's only data I've given you that I can then take elsewhere.
Well, let me give you another example. So in our app, we have one-to-one messaging, right? And it's all secured. And basically, we keep no copy of it on our servers. So once it's been safely delivered, there's only two places it exists. person who sent it and the person who received it, and you both have a copy of that. In my view, that's perfectly fine, because it's obvious that this is now your data, because it's us two that have shared this, so it's our data. Right? It's very clear that you should be allowed to move that elsewhere. It's a lot less clear when you're talking at scale with a large number of people who've done things without thinking about the subsequent consequences of what that could be used for if moved into another platform and utilized for a subtly different purpose. So how do we make sure that when data is moved or transported, which is what they're doing at the moment, is facilitating this movement of data, is that the purpose is moved with it and the limitation purpose is moved with it. This is something I was discussing with the DCMS in a portability workshop that they were having about the future of data. And I did a lot of work on this in the US with the US DoD on semantic data modeling and how it is. And in my view, it would be possible to evolve a standardization method for semantically wrapping data with the purpose and ensuring that the data cannot be utilized unless it meets that specific purpose, and that is architecturally mandated. That's my dream. I think we're probably 10, 15 years away from actually achieving that, but I'm pushing DCMS to think about that at this point in time. I think you knew that.
Catherine, you wanted to jump in.
So I don't feel quite equipped to follow up on that incredibly sort of precise technical point, because the point I wanted to make was a much broader one, which is I find it really interesting that we're talking here in a room full of people with high levels of understanding and expertise, and you're saying I can't prove how that advertising was targeted at me, and you're saying I get these fountain pen accessories that seem weirdly precise. And what we found is that the lack of understanding around the way that technologies operate, on the one hand, leads to a kind of, wide-eyed naivety that everything's fine. But for some people, it's leading to a real catastrophization. So not understanding, actually, I think long-term for the industry is very, very pernicious, because people think the worst. As well as thinking the best, they're thinking the worst. There's a lot, particularly around voice technologies. We were speaking in the office about someone's birthday. I wasn't, I didn't search anything, and then next minute it's on my phone. There's adverts for birthday cakes. But I think what is really problematic is, yes, you might be able to show me, but the point is people don't know, and there's two ways this goes. One is everyone says la la la, it's all fine, no worries, and the other is people feel extremely scared essentially by the whole thing. And I think that's, if there's an incentive on industry to sort this out, it's that people's negative perceptions and their painting the industry as worse than it is can potentially really take off.
So just in terms of that sort of following thing, as you might expect, I'm somebody who uses private, search engines that are private by design. I use privacy settings up the wazoo on my browser. I set every privacy setting I can on my phone. And yet, something funny was going on, because these adverts were still following me. I was going, something is still getting data. Because I know I'm not sharing it with cookies, because I clean all those cookies out. And I know that it's nothing to do with the browsers I'm using. I know all this stuff. So how the hell is it happening? So I went through my phone really carefully. I thought that I've missed something. And it wasn't where you'd expect to find it. But what I found was, on my Android phone, Samsung S9, latest version 6 of their thing, under connection settings, okay, not quite sure why it's there, there was another setting called more connection settings. I go, oh, okay, what's that? And there's something called nearby device scanning, and it was on. And I thought, oh, I wonder what that is. And what it said, let me just read it to you. It's on by default for every single Samsung phone user in this country right now, which is several million of you, probably some in this room. Scan for and connect to nearby devices easily. Devices will appear in the quick panel or notification area where they are available. Okay, sounds okay so far. Nearby device scanning uses Bluetooth low energy scanning and the microphone. Okay. So I thought, right, I'll turn this bugger off. And guess what? I haven't had these adverts following me ever since. But, and here's what's really slightly confusing, is that since I turned this setting off, Google now refuses to sync my contacts. It won't sync my contact until I turn this setting back on again. Now, I cannot for the life of me figure out the correlation between those 2 points, right? But they are clearly forcing me, in order to get my data backed up, to turn my microphone on so that they can listen to me all the time and send me these bloody adverts. And what else are they listening to, by the way?
Yes.
No, I think this is precisely the point, actually, that, you helped me, actually. Mark Zuckerberg in his sort of theory presentation for these individuals in Washington. I mean, I actually felt theory too, because he said he himself was hacked. Oh. He had his account, poor chap. Oh. But I think he made out a sort of, this is the problem, you see. We've all sort of taken in by this posturing. And I think we ought not to be taken in by this. And I think the Washington establishment also was sort of is being taken in by this posturing. Because I hope they're listening to us actually in this, because I think it's really important, because I think this will help the Americans understand that their sort of economic model actually needs some tinkering, and that in fact the world is no longer prepared to take whatever is coming to them. Especially in Europe, I think we're not prepared to take it. And GDPR is a first exemplar of actually what is likely to happen in Europe actually if the Americans are not careful. Their economic model will be disturbed in a big way. And I think Washington is worried that actually if they ask too many questions of Facebook, they'll have to ask similar questions to Microsoft and YouTube and all the other platforms which the Americans dominate. And this could severely affect the American economic model, and in fact, Mr. Trump's economic model actually as well. So I think, that's why I'm not taken in by Mark Zuckerberg. He's a nice guy. I think he started Facebook because he really wanted his mates as a 19-year-old kid to check out the chicks.
Yeah, exactly. That's all he was. Face smash.
Yeah, I think that's how the platform started. It's a bit like what happened to internet. I mean, one of the reasons it became so popular is because, of course, pornography was a very important source of revenue for a very long time. It's no longer the case, actually, apparently. But really, I think we really should be aware of this. Of course, Britain is leaving Europe, unfortunately, or maybe. We still have time to prevent that.
Are we moving the landmass?
We've been wanting to move the landmass for a long time. We've always talked of Europe as if it's somewhere else, actually, but we've always done that. Yeah, the point I'm really trying to make is that we really have to wake up to this fact that we should stop being bullied by this. That in fact we should, the other point I wanted to make is that I spoke to a Chinese policymaker on this issue after he made a very important, very powerful remark. He said, we're not prepared, at actually Chatham House a few months back, he said, we're not prepared to share our data with you, but that's our future. That's our, crown jewels. And in fact, they have been extremely good at this, actually. And they're one of the few countries, free regions, which have actually created a silo for themselves,
However, as the Washington Post, in a very recent article, which should chill us, a bit like the remark thing about the pen, which I'm sorry I'm sort of going on and on. Stop me, please. But the pen issue is that, because our data is available to Google and whatnot, they're able to, yeah, that's right, connect. Whereas the Chinese data is not available to us. And of course, the only people who can trace individuals in China are the state. So, for example, Washington Post gave a very chilling article, actually, recently, a few days ago, of a person who was caught up in a traffic incident, very minor, actually. She didn't have a document. So the traffic cop said, "Where is your document?" And the person, "I don't have it." So the traffic cop sort of goes across the road to the traffic cop station, prints out her details, right, and then charges her whatever she has to pay for her.
Well, China's, of course, going through this social scoring system, and that's a very chilling activity.
It is completely chilling, and I think what I'm saying is that I really have one of the few areas in the world where we have what we call a rule of law, right? The right of the individual. We're going to lose that if we don't protect ourselves in Europe.
So if I can follow up on that. So
stop myself.
Okay. Okay.
So,
Richard and Joe.
So I wanted to pick up on the point about associations. If I give an entirely fictional example, if we imagine a female cabinet minister sleeping with a male prime minister, which could of course never happen, then if one of those individuals chooses to disclose that, that's breaching the privacy of the other individual. So there's a kind of fetishization of the individual in a lot of this discussion, whereas actually the things that we care about concealing most are things that involve other people, and we don't seem to have a proper way of talking about how we protect our associations and what are the protocols for sharing my data. My DNA is not only my DNA, it's also my close relatives. So have I got the right not only to sell my data, but also my siblings, my children? It isn't just the individual that we need to worry about here.
And then,
yeah, I think my point connects with yours, and I was just really struck with your point, Catherine, early on. And just by like the news coverage of the Cambridge Analytica and the Mark Zuckerberg, this kind of, which is really about a focus on individuals' privacy and security. And yet your point really is that the threat is not really to individuals, but it is a societal impact. And that, I think, connects with your point about trust being a systemic and contextual problem. It feels like we're kind of pressing on the wrong part in order to try and solve these. That isn't where the problem is. We need to be paying attention to how networks change the way individuals have agency in society and how society then needs to deal with it. And we don't seem to have the institutions or processes to deal with that.
That kind of follows a really quick thank you for using the word agency. I think it's absolutely critical to this debate. What is it in the system that is giving effect to my preferences and intentions?
Yeah, and I had two things that I wanted to say. One was kind of following from what Geoff was saying, what Ruth was just saying about agency. Geoff, when you describe someone with a quite a highly technical background and who's very invested in all of this stuff, and the trouble that you had digging away in your privacy settings to get to something to try and switch this stuff off what hope on earth does an ordinary person have? They have nothing. So that kind of then begs the question, do we have to go to the platform and expect them to get their act together and start fixing things? And how on earth can we trust them to do that when they've done such a terrible job so far? And I guess an example of that, I wanted to reference something that Robin spoke about in terms of these spaces like feeling like they're social, but they're not social spaces at all. They're commercial spaces. And I've seen in my kind of initial study that I'm doing at the moment for my PhD, I've seen that come up because, and it's partly deliberate, I think, on Facebook's part, because when there's some kind of data breach or something, they have these little things pop up that say, oh, you know, let's talk about privacy then. Here's where you can go and select which of your friends can see your status. And that's not what this is about. It's not about that. And it's this real deliberate conflation of social privacy and commercial privacy. Something that one of my participants said to me was, you know, I don't understand because I'm getting adverts that are clearly targeted to demographic information that's on my Facebook profile that's set to only me visible. You know, it's to do with my age, and I've got my birthday set to private on my Facebook. My friends can't see it, but Facebook can see it, and all of Facebook's friends can see it. Yeah, and people don't know. Yes, it's not really a question exactly, more just.
I'm happy that you chose that example because I've just heard Facebook's latest narrative about those privacy settings and those pop-ups and the helpful information, and it was like being shown the show home at a new housing development. And I'm delighted to have seen one of the second-hand properties which are actually the thing that will actually be sold. Thank you.
So I'd like to wrap the last person's comments with on the economic side of things. So absolutely, what's really interesting is that, you know, I've got a commercial hat on, and no matter what you say and do, unfortunately, the internet has evolved to a place where just because I go online, somebody makes money. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be, because it puts a commercialization on society in a role, in a way that's never happened in society before, ever. And we don't know how to deal with that. What we're dealing with in our platform is we remove that problem and say, actually, no, you commercialize some other aspect of the opportunity. But you can't get away from this idea that you know, that these Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons have all built this model that basically says, as soon as you're here, we got you, and we're going to get everything about you and sell everything about you. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be, and I think we need to find ways to move that. And I think the interesting thing about the GDPR is that fundamentally, the way I sometimes look at it, it's a bit like a economic war. What we now know is that, you know, how much money these big digital players are making, and it's a hell of a lot. We know that we barely see in this part of the world a tiny percentage of that in terms of return back to our society in terms of benefit or anything else. You know, yeah, they'll go and buy off a few politicians by promising to open up a new fancy office somewhere. Great, a bit of real estate and a bit of tax returns on some employees, right? And oh, by the way, you know, don't corporate tax us, will you? Of course not. So what I think is interesting about the GDPR is that it's creating an opportunity to restate the nature of the internet and create a new battlefield and move the data, which is what it's actually doing. It's literally moving the data back under the control of the European state, and basically saying, you know, if you want to access our society's data, you have to play by our rules. And that is a fundamental game changer, because if you look at the business model of Facebook and you look at the GDPR, they are fundamentally in conflict at an absolute basic level. At a basic level, GDPR says effectively the data belongs to you. Now, ownership and law, we won't get into that, but let's just say don't go down that road. But it's the implication, it's the benefit of that thought process that the GDPR is trying to facilitate. And the American model is very much the opposite of that. You go online, you're ripe for commercialization. And by changing the battlefield, I think there's a real hope that companies like ourselves and many others, will get an opportunity to redefine the way in which we do business online. And I think that's what's got to happen. But it has to happen at an economic level. you're not going to win this fight by proselytizing how much better it would be. Because I can tell you right now, we've built a fundamentally private by design platform. Do I pitch that to my potential users? Do I help? Because your data has just shown they don't actually care. Well, they do care, but they don't care enough to make a separate decision. They care about the consequences of it at some point. They're worried about stuff, but they don't think they're in control of it anyway. So they don't make a decision to buy my platform because it's private by design. Now, over time, I'm hoping that they will learn that we're building a platform that's fundamentally trustworthy and it's the kind of thing that they and their kids could use. But I'm not betting on that as the way in which we're going to make money. We've got to make money in a different way to the way the American model says it's going to make money. And that's a really difficult thing to think about in this context. But if you don't answer the commercial question, we're just going to be going round and round in circles for a very long time because money makes the world go round.
Yeah. Shall we take two? Yeah. In the back.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, picking up on Geoff's comment that whatever you do on the internet, someone makes money. I can't resist quoting Karl Marx, who said that all is solid knots into air, all is sacred is profane. So, in other words, the idea that whenever you want to do something, somebody wants to make money out of it is actually not unique to the internet and is not even particularly new. But as to what we do about it, I mean, I really liked Robin's contribution about having a better definition of trust and a better conceptual basis, actually, rather than starting off by just saying, well, privacy is a good thing and data protection must be a good thing. There we are. You know, how do we get that? So, I mean, if you think, I mean, for example, there's been quite a lot of work done in how people trust what they see on the internet and how they know what they're talking to on the internet. But, you know, people trust Amazon and Facebook and the big platforms, partly because they're so familiar and they provide them with a nice service, and they put a lot of effort into looking nice. You know, if you get something from somebody saying, I'm a Nigerian millionaire, click on this website, and it comes up, it's not in very good English, then you're not going to trust it. So, I mean, from that point of view, you could say that Facebook is actually a bit of a con man, and not only Facebook. I mean, Facebook's in the frame at the moment. They're doing exactly what a con man would do, making themselves look really nice, and then actually doing something which isn't very nice. As to what we should do about that, I don't think there's a simple answer. I mean, I personally really dislike monopolies, particularly private monopolies. And as has been said, I think Geoff said it several times, you can't just leave Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. Well, you can, but if you do, then you can't have the facilities that those organisations offer you. Whereas things like the actual original design of the internet was exactly the opposite of that. It was designed to be as open as possible. You could have, if I wanted to set up a web server, I could set up a web server or an email service or quite a lot of other different services. Usenet, if you can remember that, and IRC and all these other different things. If you didn't like one provider because you thought they were selling your data or they're giving you bad service or whatever, you could go to another one. So that's, in my opinion, that could be quite an important part of the answer. I mean, regulation, proper governance, a certain amount of user choice. So on. It'd be interesting to see whether Europe gets a competitive advantage from being seen as a safe place to do business, or whether, as has happened up till heretofore, the USA establishes more or less hegemony basically by having this very open policy. So I mean, you know, you couldn't have had Google, Facebook, and all that stuff. Wouldn't have established themselves to anything like the same extent, even under the existing European data protection regime, because I mean, having established themselves, they were not able to get into the European market. But you know, they could. I think it could have happened the other way around. So anyway, we'll see which way it pans out. I think that's all I've got to say.
Well, in April 2016, which is when the GDPR came into force, people kind of forget that one. It has actually been a law since then. I actually ran an event called Privacy, the Competitive Advantage, and I had the Chief Attorney Advisor for the FTC come over, and I had the Deputy Director for the GDPR come and talk. And what was interesting, it was just having that title got them into the room. And it was a sellout. We had a packed room, and we had people from the FT there who I was expecting to turn up for the free lunch and actually turned up at 9 in the morning and didn't leave until 6 in the evening on a bank holiday weekend. So I was like, okay, there's something interesting going on here. You know, people are looking at it and saying, you know, something is changing. Right? What it is, they didn't know, but they wanted to find out more. And I thought that was very encouraging for companies like ourselves at that point in time, because we were feeling kind of lone voices in the wilderness at the time.
I just wanted to add another question, a slightly different dimension, which picks up on this. If we're talking about trust, it's not just about privacy, but if we're talking about online platforms and trust, it's also not just about us, the end users, it's also about the other side, be it the advertisers, or be it if we're talking about something like Amazon or a online booking service or something like that, the other companies that are needing the platform as a way to access users. And they have also big issues with being able to trust the services that they're actually getting. If Facebook says video streams on their thing are getting so many views, is that really true? Or what does Facebook call a view? Is seeing a 1 second, split second of the video, does that count as having watched the whole video? If you're a hotel that's doing business with one of the big platforms, mediator platforms for that, what kind of negotiation abilities do you have, given that there's only basically two major companies that you have to deal with? You don't know why your hotel suddenly is dropped in the rankings. And so there's a trust issue on that side, which I think then brings up the question, how should we deal with this? And we have already identified that the platforms do provide an important service. That's why people say, yeah, I don't like it, but I'm still going to stay on it. So then the question is, they provide an important service to connect different sides, as, for instance, does our infrastructure. Roads provide an important service to bring us from home to our work, etc. The infrastructure, we've decided, perhaps shouldn't be run as commercial services. Should we be thinking differently about what the role of these platforms actually is, and therefore the way in which they should be run? Maybe some comments along that line.
Just a quick one. Like Geoff, I am fairly privacy paranoid, and I use different browsers for different contexts, and I wipe cookies. And in answer to the Facebook question, I did leave Facebook. I had a pseudonymous Facebook account for a while to find out what Facebook's privacy settings were like. And the more they changed the terms and conditions on me, the less comfortable I became with even having a pseudonymous account. And so I deleted that. I've recently set up a WhatsApp account because otherwise I wasn't going to get any messages from my kids, basically. But I've done it on a separate handset with a pay-as-you-go SIM, and so an unregistered SIM. And oddly, that is the only phone on which I have ever received those spam calls from people asking if I've been in an accident lately, which is quite strange. But so with all that about my willingness to sacrifice convenience and use different platforms to different contexts, sometimes different devices, and then I think of myself as fairly savvy about things like making travel bookings. So sometimes I might go and look something up on the ba.com site and then think, well, okay, they've quoted me a price. What will I get off Expedia? Go and have a look there. Then think, well, I wonder what Trivago does for a hotel there. And think I'm really being really savvy about looking at, searching on Expedia and searching on Trivago. Trivago belongs to Expedia, along with half a dozen other booking sites, it turns out. And I've got a graphic here, but I can't zoom in on it enough to read the names. But there's a huge transparency deficit there too, that I think I'm shopping around, and I'm not shopping around because they're all under the same half dozen brands. And I think we've been very cautious so far about putting a burden on the user to sort out their own privacy, and rightly so. But on the other hand, as individuals, it's never been easier for us to do that investigation. 10 years ago, it would have taken me, I don't know, a week to find out who the parent companies of Facebook and Google and Twitter and TripAdvisor were. On the internet, it took me about 20 minutes. So it's never been easier for us to do it. I'm similarly wary of putting the burden on the individual to have to do that, but I think it's something we should be willing and prepared to do sometimes.
Yeah. So I think inevitably we've talked a lot about trust as in the use of data and privacy, but I think trust is a much broader issue than that. And I'm glad that you brought that up, Ansgar. One of the things we're talking about is responsible technology, and we see that in a holistic way. And I think one of the concerns, certainly in terms of the way that policymakers are responding to this, is they're seeing individual issues. So they think about, data ethics as one problem, or they think about misogynistic abuse on Twitter as one problem. We need to think about systemic issues. So if we focus simply on privacy, that wouldn't actually allow us to address something like Uber's use of Revill software. So thinking about responsible technology as a whole, I think starts to bring in issues like the trustworthiness across a whole range of things. For me, it's important that responsible technology considers how much the Amazon delivery driver is being paid. That is part of a responsibility, and it comes outside of the use of my private information. Part of being responsible in technology is ensuring that your websites are accessible to everyone, no matter what situation they arrive in. It's about the understandability. So it's not just, I think, data feels very important. It is very important. It's very newsworthy at the moment. But there's a danger that if we focus specifically on fixing the problems of privacy, we're missing out on fixing a whole ecosystem which is needed to make technology responsible.
Do we have a... Okay. Where is the mic? Do we know where the mic is?
So obviously, Geoff, with the crowd, you found a format whereby you can make money, because you're saying it has to be commercial. You can't just expect Facebook to suddenly not be making any money. You found a format by which you can make money in an ethical way. What might be the format that Facebook can use? Because the only kind of semi-alternatives that some companies have going is maybe someone like Spotify, the freemium setup, whereby if you don't want adverts, you can pay. But there's also kinds of flaws in that. First of all, does that mean just because you're not getting adverts, does that mean they're not taking your data? Probably not, realistically. And also, even if that were the case, if paying for the service meant that they wouldn't take your data, well, that's great. Then we have a situation where only poor people are having their data exploited. So it's kind of a huge and maybe unfair question, but do you have any thoughts on what kind of alternative model someone like Facebook might have analogous to what you found with the crowd?
I would say that whether or not I could come up with an answer to that is irrelevant, in as much that unless their shareholders were willing to buy into a change of a business model, which is what it would require, unless they were willing to do that, it isn't going to go anywhere. And so it's one of the interesting things when I was building up Crowd, and it's still a private company, I'm in charge, so I get to set rules. What happens when we get significant investment? What happens when commercial imperatives start to take hold on my business if we get big enough for that? And it's something we spent a lot of time thinking about. We looked at B Corps, we looked at charity structures, we looked at all the different formats. and none of them really allowed me to compete at the commercial level. So I felt, okay, we've got to be a commercial company, we've got to do it at that level. So then I looked at, okay, so how do I then ensure that if a shareholder takes over our business and takes a degree of control, that the values that we espouse are sustained? It's just like, I mean, the thing that sort of made sure I thought about it was when WhatsApp was bought by Facebook. You know, Facebook made a load of great promises and everyone knew they were lying through their teeth. And they've been proven to be lying through their teeth. And the regulators in some parts of Europe have basically told them to not do what they were planning to do. Which, in other words, to actually keep the promise that they originally gave. Our approach was to move from a data-centric revenue model to a service-centric revenue model, and to make the value of that service the thing that people pay for, but not the individual, because it was very clear to me that the individuals won't pay in most instances. There are models where that will work, but not for what we were trying to do. So I had to find somebody else with a commercial interest who would facilitate, who would see value in the engagement opportunity. So for us, it was about facilitating the participation of somebody in that engagement opportunity. Now, Facebook is fundamentally an engagement platform. It's a communication platform. It's a connectivity platform. That's the thing they talk about. We're going to connect everybody. So I would suggest that it would be viable, if you put the shareholders to one side for a second, to think about a different kind of business model for them, where actually, as a ubiquitous service provider, that they can obtain revenues from all sorts of other channels without actually having to take your data and sell it directly. And they already have the capacity to do that because of their ubiquitousness already. But that transition would be challenging, to say the least, and would almost certainly not be supported by the shareholders. And that's the problem. They're already, where they are is where they are.
Just quickly, interesting when you talk about WhatsApp and kind of the systems as a service as a business model, and it's interesting because it just reminded me of Whisper Systems, who've made Signal, the encrypted messaging application for your phone, and then they were actually commissioned by WhatsApp to make the encryption happen for WhatsApp. So it can happen, but whether, like you say, companies that have already committed to, these business models that are data driven, can they really undo that? Probably not, I would say.
Your microphone. Recently, European Union MEP, I think she's a Dutch MEP, suggested a compromise that perhaps the back office could be made open. I mean, sorry, could be audited by an independent organization. And I think perhaps she was suggesting a compromise because she was saying, really, this is probably one way forward, and perhaps the platforms ought to be trusting this idea. I don't know what you think of this compromise idea.
Thank you. I think it's a really good question, and it ties in quite nicely with some work that I did last year about trust frameworks. In the slides I put up earlier, I listed a number of commitments that I thought a data controller ought to be willing to make. Well, if you imagine that you go to a particular website and there on the website is an icon, like a fair trade symbol. And if you click on that icon, you get that statement of 3 principles that provider, that data controller, has signed up to. And if you click on one of those principles that says, for example, we promise to treat you fairly with regard to your data, then you get a page that says, when we say fairly, what we mean is these things. We promise to set a retention period when we collect your data, and we promise to actually delete the data at the end of the retention period. And the retention period won't be, it'll be a defined and short period, yeah? So you can envisage a tiered model like that, where the lower tier that is what gets you your trust mark. The lower tier is stuff that can be audited. So I think that is a valid approach, and I hope it is also a viable approach.
I'm afraid this is going to have to be the last question.
Well, actually, I just wanted to make a comment on that in a degree. So, as an organisation that's trying to build a fundamentally trustworthy platform, the question was, why would anybody trust us? Just because I say so, right? I've said some nice things today. Maybe I've read up pretty well. Why would the hell do you trust us? And so the question I asked myself, well, how do we get audited? How do we get validated for this? And by the way, what exactly do you get audited for to be trustworthy? It was a really interesting exercise that I went through. And yeah, you can seek auditing for security, for your IT stuff, ISO 27001, but that doesn't mean my product is secure by design. There isn't actually a standard for secure by design for end products, which I found completely baffling. In certain markets like the defense sector where I worked before, if you want to say something is safe, you have to go through an incredibly powerful auditing process to get that software validated as being safe by design. And fundamentally secure by design in certain defense processes with common criteria and stuff like that. And I find it really intriguing that we don't have that here in the UK, even at the basic security level, right? So I thought, okay, that's really interesting. There's nothing out there that I can validate with security, that our product is secure by design. So you just got to trust that point. So I thought, well, okay, what about privacy by design? And there's nothing out there that's truly validatory, independently able to validate that we've built a product private by design. Interestingly, Anka Vukian, who I'm sure a few people in the room may be aware of, who is a strong leader and proponent on the privacy by design principles, she's now at Ryerson's, and she went and started developing a program with Deloitte's. And I thought, well, that might be interesting. Go and get validated by them. Yeah, I'm a little startup. It'll be £30,000 to £50,000. Thanks very much. Okay, that's not going to happen, at least not just yet. So we couldn't go through that one either. So when it comes down to it, when you even if you are able to define this trust thing, who validates it? Well, I am starting by self-assertion, and proof over time. But my point is that where are the processes? Now, I do know that the UK government has actually started moving its trustworthy software initiative away from or evolving that towards secure by design validation certification, which is something that's initiated a couple of weeks ago. So that's going to happen. And the reason they did that was because they realized the Internet of Things is a dangerous thing if it's not built secure. So they're going to start actually asking people to validate that they are building secure Internet of Things, which is a good thing. But we're probably a year or so away from getting that. And we don't even have that. And I think that's really problematic in terms of those who want to do the right thing being able to put their hand in the air and say, and I can prove it. Because until I can say I can prove it, there's no commercial value. And that's a difficulty.
So the last question, we're running out of time.
It sort of serves a bit of a conclusion. I sort of count myself as an optimist and a bit of evangelist when it comes to sort of personal data, sort of agency, privacy, all of those things. And I agree with pretty much everything that's been said here today. GDPR is a great thing. Regulation should provide a framework for a better world. Companies like yours, Geoff, are doing something that's genuinely in the interest of individuals, respectful, ethical, all those sorts of things. But there is a but, and there's a sense that by wishing for a better, nicer internet is a little bit like wishing for a better, nicer world. So I'm going to sort of seek your opinions rather than sort of concrete answers. Given that technology tends to move faster than regulation, given that usually businesses observe the letter of the law much more than the spirit of the law, and a lot of them don't even observe that, how optimistic are you as the panel that the sort of the ideal world that's described by regulation, by GDPR, by agency, by empowerment, all those sorts of things becoming a reality, or will we just get a certain way towards that? Will the world improve but never be perfect? And could trust be a differentiator? Could it be a business model that actually makes more sense to more companies rather than just to companies like yours? And is that going to be the tipping point? Will people eventually live in a better world because of the utility they're given, rather than just embracing the idea of privacy and trust as nice things?
It'll always be via utility, and therefore we'll always have a gap between our desires of the people in this room and the way society actually is. When I first started building the Crowd, I thought, maybe I can make it really good so that my children grow up in a better internet society. My realization now is, at best, it'll be their children. I reckon we're a couple of generations away from undoing the problem. For people like myself, it's all over, right? There is very little that they don't know, and will at some point get exposed because it will get hacked or lost or something like that. So it's too late for me. And I've realized it's already too late for my 18-year-old daughter, or 19-year-old daughter. Whoops. Just recently. I'm now thinking more beyond to the next generation and saying that's where we've got to get to. And will it be perfect then? No. But it could be a hell of a lot better. And really it's about, it is the empowerment point at the beginning, and I think I want to pick up on it. It's in one slide. That to me is the central point. Is at the moment the internet has turned into a disempowering activity where I go online, I'm commercialized, I have no idea for what purpose and who the data is going to and what's happening with it, and I'm not in control, and I don't have transparency, and I have no means of remedy. So I'm completely disempowered in the trust context. All the 3 building blocks of trust just don't exist. Regulatory is coming in, so the remedy elements being strengthened. Good. It requires greater levels of transparency. That's good. Is the control really there? A little bit, right? So it's heading in the right direction. Will that be enough to create commercial entities that can successfully compete against the US behemoths and their business model? I think probably not for a couple of generations. And even then, I'm not entirely hopeful. I think we'll see more segregation at national level between service provision and regulatory controls.
So on that optimistic note, maybe if we can have a brief concluding remark from everyone on the panel, if you wanted to make one.
I'll make it related to this. I suppose optimistic, it depends, what kind of society do we want, and what's our vision of that. And I think there is a generational change in terms of people's attitudes to what privacy means to them. So I think the idea of, putting privacy back into the box maybe is not the one to focus on. I think the question of trust is the one. And so I'm optimistic that we get to a situation where people better understand the technologies that they use and the impacts that those technologies have, that they're more informed and have greater agency, as you say, over the choices and the trade-offs they make. That is maybe a different thing than saying we have better privacy, if you see what I mean. People may not have privacy, but they may know that and they may understand why that's happening. And for me, that would be a great improvement.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to kind of pick up on this whole sort of futures prediction. And while I am quite confident that we will get to a place where regulation and legislation will probably catch up with today in 30 or 40 years' time, I am confident that it will happen. At this point, I think we should be mindful that we are shaping it around our current society. So we are privileged in the UK. We are talking about American companies, and we are representing a very, very privileged position of all of the users of the internet. And I think at this point, we need to kind of almost take a little bit of a breathing space and think, who are the internet users? This is not just Europe. This is not just Asia, and it's certainly not just the North America. We need to start engaging the global South and making sure that their opinions and their societies are also part of this new kind of chapter, I guess. And I think this Cambridge Analytica kind of is actually beginning a new chapter in terms of, I know that the GDPR has been talked about for a long time, but it seems like we have a real new sort of slate that we can start to move forward with. And I think that we need to be addressing that as as a world, as as a global conversation, rather than just some folks in London on a Thursday evening.
So for me, time is the most important thing. It's the greatest educator of them all. People like people in this room, highly educated, have been up to speed with the issues for quite a while and trying to think about resolution. But the vast majority of the population, as the studies have shown, are still a long way behind. But compared to where they were, they're a lot more aware. My children think they're in control because of the way in which they set their privacy settings on their devices. Despite the fact I have educated them, or at least attempted to, when they're willing to listen to Dad, which probably isn't as often as I'd like. Even though I've educated them to the realities of what's going on, they're still choosing to continue in that engagement process. But time is the educator. And we're seeing change because people are becoming aware of the consequences. So you talked about the consequences thing has been mentioned several times in this conversation. And I think Cambridge Analytica is just one more example of a wide range of consequences we're beginning to see and understand. And as more people see and understand them, they'll react and look for alternatives. And it's the moment they look for an alternative that there needs to be something there to give them the competitive alternative to what's out there right now. And that is clearly all the evidence I've seen. I've been tracking this for 6 years now from a commercial point of view. The evidence is the awareness is growing, the desire is growing, but the capability to shift hasn't really happened yet. And I think the regulatory environment will assist in that process, and I think that's a very good thing. And yes, it is about trust and not privacy, because it's really about, because trust actually is something that's great for society and it's good for business, right? Every brand, anybody developing a brand will tell you that the basic building block of a brand is the trust of what it represents. And every brand works really hard to develop that understanding. And that's where the economic, the commercial, and the societal meet, I think. And from where we started in the internet, where we are now with this highly commercialized world, you can't get away from that aspect of things. So you need to embrace it and figure out how to use it to your commercial advantage. And that's where I think the GDPR helps. It doesn't solve the problem, but it sets the standard, and it gives the opportunity for competitive alternative to evolve. And I think that's a good thing. And we've just got to find ways to help the broader populace that aren't really educated enough. I'll say not educated enough, aware enough of the short-term consequences to help them understand when they do recognize them, how they can do something about it and not just feel disempowered and feel, okay, there's nothing I can do. Give them something to do and they will change. And we've got to give them that alternative.
Thank you, Geoff. I think I've got 3 thoughts, really. And the first one was really spurred by what Catherine said. It just occurred to me, what if my desired end state is that we live in a more pessimistic world? My second thought was, and I think Ansgar and Joe in the audience and Kate on the panel are reasons for optimism, is that the Horizon Centre is obviously doing a damn good job of attracting good minds and putting them to good use. And I find that very encouraging. So thank you all 3 of you for restoring some of my faith in some of my fellow human beings, despite my evil tendencies. Okay, so the third one is to come back to your question, which is, with all these nice words, are we just wishing for a nicer world? Well, hell yes. And I'm going to go back to fossil fuel analogies briefly. Data protection rules have a role here. I'm not proposing that we discard them, but we have to put them in context. And rules for data protection are like rules for the safe handling of petrol. You can have perfectly safe handling, distribution, and use of petrol, and the planet can still boil. So what we need in the trust and privacy world is the equivalent of a carbon policy, something that looks at the whole ecosystem of personal data, not just the safety rules for its handling, but the outcomes that we want, as Kate said, as a planet, as a society. So I think we do need to aim that high. We do need to think about the economics of it. And pretty much everything that Geoff said made it clear that if you try and change the behavior of the principal stakeholders, the data controllers, without giving them an economic incentive to behave differently, they won't do it. But here I think is where the analogy with fossil fuels, we can part from that, because the good thing is that if you want to change the economics of an information society, then trust is one of your main tools for doing so. Trust can actually change the economic equation, and I think that is our strongest hope for trust as a source of influence.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel very much. It's been a very stimulating conversation. Also, the audience for your very stimulating questions. So, thank you.
And I'd like to thank Ansgar, of course, for moderating this and for proposing the topic, and his colleagues for putting it all together. So thank you very much. I'd also like to recognize Louise Bennett, who's been helping us out with hosting this over at BCS. So thank you very much, Louise. And of course, this is not the end of the discussion. There's more that is going to take place during the rest of this year. The next thing that we have is Eurodig at the beginning of June, European Dialogue on Internet Governance that takes place a little bit far away in Georgia, Tbilisi. Very nice wine, beautiful Georgian wine, very pleasant location. But this topic is very likely to be one of the really hot topics for this year. So that one is there. And then, of course, the UK Internet Governance Forum. The UK IGF will be in the latter part of the year. We still don't quite know where the global IGF will be, but we certainly know that the UK IGF will be in London. So that's at least one thing that we know. And finally, just to say there's a few more drinks outside. And thanks to, of course, all of you for having come over. This is all recorded, as we mentioned earlier, so it will be put on the web within a couple of days. And of course, we'll be pixelating all the sorry. The slides, yes. Are you okay with sharing your slides? Yeah. Okay. So we'll put them also on the website www.isoc-e.org. I'd like to also thank finally Jolie McPhee, who is over in New York and who's managed to do some remote counseling for the technical stuff. I don't know how he does this, but it always works just a few minutes behind time, but it still does work. So thanks very much. And keep a watch for our next topics. If you have any idea for a topic that we need to address in a meeting such as this one, then please bring them forward, and we'll see if we can put together a little team and organize it. So thank you.